Oh, yeah.
Good afternoon and welcome to Grant Cottage. Thank you all for coming up. Steve Trimm to my right does many of these Porsche chats, as some of you will know. Today's is on the relationship or the parallels between Grant and Dwight Eisenhower. We have some other events coming up this summer, including on Sunday, August 5th, we'll have a picnic performance with music. On Wednesday, August the 8th, we'll have a Flags Half-Mast ceremony. That's the date of Grant's New York City funeral in 1885. But when this program ends, we will do tours. For those of you who bought tickets down in the visitor center, it may be that we won't be able to get you all in on the first tour, but I may take a group down to the Overlook, and there's other things around here that you can look at while you wait for the tours to begin. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Steve, who also, in case he doesn't tell you, has a recently published book on saving Grant Cottage, which is on sale down in the visitor center.
It's actually a booklet. It's not as grandiose as a book, but it does have some pretty good stories. All right, one of the great joys about being a history buff is when you find information about someone in the past that's brand new to you. And even better is when you discover that beliefs you held about someone are totally wrong. That's really exciting. And here at Grant Cottage, we just have a small community of amateur historians, and we are always talking and we are learning from each other. And if you ever want to volunteer and join us, we'll be glad to see you here. Where did this crazy idea for this porch chat come from? Well, volunteers know it is related that before Dwight Eisenhower wrote his memoirs about fighting in Europe, he read Grant's memoirs. And that's all we're usually ever told. I found that intriguing, and I wanted to know, first of all, so he read them. So what? Did he follow Grant's lead in any way? So that's where I'm going to begin. Grant's memoirs have never been out of print. I think Eisenhower probably read them at West Point initially, but he reread them after World War II. So, I got a copy of Eisenhower's memoir, Crusade in Europe, and I read it. And I discovered that he, in fact, had followed Grant's lead. Eisenhower, like Grant, checked his ego at the door. He wrote almost objectively of what he had seen and what he had experienced, and he did not put himself in the center of the story as the great hero of civilization. Grant did not put himself in the center of his story as the great hero of the Union. Both men were very modest about their roles in their particular wars. So yes, Eisenhower did follow Grant's lead. And I thought that's where my inquiry was going to end. But by chance, I don't always read about Civil War history. I read stuff from all historical eras, including the 1960s in America. I lived through that time, as you did, and I'm still trying to figure out what went on. So, by chance, I was reading this book, Remembering America, by Richard Goodwin. You have heard of Doris Kearns Goodwin? This is her husband. He worked in the Kennedy White House and then the Johnson White House. And that's where he met Doris, actually, was in LBJ's White House. And Richard Goodwin was the liberals' liberal, the penultimate liberal. And I thought I knew what I was going to read here, but I was surprised. Goodwin begins his book with the incoming Kennedy administration and the outgoing Eisenhower administration. And to my astonishment, here's what Goodwin wrote about Ike. He brought the Korean conflict to a swift conclusion, and throughout his term, he sent no Americans into combat. He was the first president since Hoover of whom this could be said, and he was to be the last for a long time. This was not merely good fortune. In Hungary and Cuba, Indochina, and the Straits of Formosa, Eisenhower resisted pressure for forceful intervention to which other presidents might have yielded. Clearly, the masses of India and Brazil and Italy and the United States understood something about this man that those of us closer to him, those of us who thought we were more sophisticated, failed to grasp. Eisenhower was a man of peace. He was infused with an essential goodwill toward his companions of the earth. They knew it, and they loved him for it. There were worse things than inaction, much worse. Well, I was shocked that a good liberal would say this about Eisenhower, whom I always thought of as a pretty traditional conservative. But there was a line here that just stopped me in my tracks. Well, two lines actually. He said, Eisenhower was a man of peace. He was infused with an essential goodwill toward his companions of the earth. That could describe Ulysses S. Grant. It really could. On Grant's tomb in New York City is carved, "Let us have peace." And at no time during the Grant administration did we go to war with anybody. Grant, despite having commanded the greatest army this continent has ever seen, was fundamentally and truly a man of peace. So I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, wow, when I came here to Grant Cottage the first time, I had all the stereotypes. Grant's a drunkard and a butcher, and I discovered that was wrong. So maybe I'd been wrong all these years about Eisenhower. It was really worth looking into, I thought. So, time for another book. I found a biography. Ike, the American Hero. Got a poster of it here. Picked this up by chance. It's by a fellow named Michael Korda. We do not have a copy of this book for sale, so I'm not hawking the book, but this was the biography I found. So I'm reading through it, learning a lot, and somewhere, 60 pages into the book, Mr. Korda suddenly compares Ike to Grant. And I thought that was interesting, but I let it go. Another 50 pages in, there's another explicit comparison between Eisenhower and Grant. And now I'm scratching my head. I said, who is this Korda guy that he's even thinking of Grant? So now I finally did my homework on Mr. Korda. It turns out that he wrote his biography of Eisenhower in 2007. This was after he wrote a best-selling book on the Battle of Britain called With the Wings of Eagles. Mm-hmm. He wrote this book on Ike in 2007, but in 2004, he'd written a biography of Grant. It's a little tinier than the biography of Ike, but here it is. Mr. Korda wrote about both these men. He compared them, and I was flabbergasted at some of the comparisons he came up with. So I want to share some of those with you. I will mention, just in passing, because all biographies mention it, that both these families, the Grants and the Eisenhowers, are quintessentially American. The first Grant ancestor to come to America was a Puritan. He came to Massachusetts Bay in 1630. The first Eisenhower ancestor came in 1741. They were Pennsylvania Dutch, which is to say German. And strangely enough, the Eisenhowers were Mennonites. You might not know the Mennonites, but they are pacifists. They in no way will engage in violence. Historically, they have sent none of their boys to war. The Eisenhowers were Mennonites. Well, Ike's dad had drifted away from the pacifist side of the Mennonite religion, but I have to say that the stubbornness associated with the Mennonites carried on, as Ike would be the first to admit. All right, let me begin with some of the parallels Mr. Korda found between these two men. And we're going to start with the silly stuff. All right? The silly stuff. In high school, in 1908, Ike appeared in a Shakespearean play, The Merchant of Venice. He appeared as Lancelot Gobbo, a servant to Shylock. This character is a clown. Ike got great reviews and never stepped on stage again in his life. Here's the parallel. Ulysses S. Grant, as the American army was gathering on the border with Mexico, just before the start of the Mexican War, a bunch of officers put on a play, a Shakespearean play. Turned out this one was Othello, and Ulysses S. Grant had the lead female role. He appeared as Desdemona. You got to remember, this is at a time the man had no beard. He was clean-shaven, handsome young fellow, so he could do the female part. He had a competitor in the auditions for the role of Desdemona, James Longstreet. Longstreet did not get the role because he was too tall. Okay. What did Ike think he was going to be when he grew up? What was his hope?
Sailor.
Well, yes and no. Originally, here's what he said. I wanted to be a real Major League Baseball player, a genuine player like Honus Wagner. Grant, who turned out to be really good in mathematics, thought at one point he might be a math professor. But as he looked back in his later years, he thought, you know, I was happiest when I was a farmer. That is really what I was cut out for. So their careers didn't go the way these guys thought they would. So there's the silly stuff. Now the moderately silly stuff. Neither was much of a student at West Point. They both got a lot of demerits. Grant wound up with 290 demerits. He really was not interested in studying at all. There is a story, I do not know if it's true, that one of the charges he was brought up on was kicking a horse, to which he replied in self-defense, "He kicked me first." Considering how much Grant loved horses, I'm a little skeptical on that, but maybe. Grant graduated in a class of 39. He was 21st in a class of 39, almost in the middle. Class of 1843. Ike acquired a lot of demerits, and here are some examples of what earned him demerits. And I remember Ike as this nice grandfatherly old figure. I just can't picture this at all. He was ordered to appear before a cadet corporal in his dress coat. So Ike decided to take this literally. He turned up stark naked except for his dress coat. Ike repeatedly went over the wall at West Point at night to sneak into the nearby towns to buy, are you ready? Ice cream. And sandwiches occasionally. He actually could have been expelled for this. That was a serious offense. In one six-month period, Ike was brought up, disciplined, put it that way, disciplined 15 times. For example, being late for chapel, late for breakfast, failing to make a reasonable effort to have his room ready for inspection, and smoking cigarettes. Yes, gentlemen smoked pipes. Right. Ike graduated, his class was 164. He graduated 125th. The year was 1915. Couple of items related to horses in these two men. Grant really was by far the best horseman in his graduating class. On graduation day, he gave a demonstration of jumping. Now, most high jumps, the bar over which the horse was to jump was at most 3 feet high. For this exhibition, Grant said to a couple of very brave young cadets, pick up the bar, place the bar on your shoulders. My horse and I will clear the bar. You won't be scratched. The name of his horse was York. He cleared the bar by 3 or 4 feet, and that record stood at West Point for 25 or 30 years. And there is a story about Ike and horses. In his day, cadets still had to learn how to ride. And Ike was riding, took a really bad fall. This was in his last year as a cadet, and he was injured. And the doctor examining him said, this is a pretty serious injury. And I tell you honestly, if you take another fall like this, you may be crippled for life. I don't think I can authorize you for graduation. So Ike and the doctor got in a debate about this, and finally they compromised. The doctor said, okay, upon graduation, you can request duty either in the infantry or the cavalry. If you will promise me you will not request duty in the cavalry, I'll clear you for graduation. And he did. On the subject of math, I told you Grant was terrific at math, far and away his easiest subject. And there is a story about Ike in a mathematics class, and this is where we begin to get serious. Ike's a cadet. I don't know what year he was, but there was a math problem put up on the blackboard. And Ike solved it in a way that was quicker and, as they say, more elegant than his math professor had mapped out. It was a whole new way to solve the problem. Now, Mr. Korda finds something really revealing in this. He says that over the course of their careers, Grant and Eisenhower both displayed a trait that Napoleon Bonaparte said was the essential ingredient in being a successful general. I can't say the phrase in French, but Napoleon called it the quick glance of genius, which is to say, in a confused situation, you can spot the core problem and its solution almost instantly. You do it almost by instinct. Later, if asked, you can sort out the steps you took to solve the problem, but at that moment, you cut through the murk, you see what the issue is, and you come up with its solution. Grant and Eisenhower both had the quick glance of genius. All right. Now, before I start talking about World War II and some very specific parallels between the two men, I want to go back to their memoirs, because there is something more revealing than what I picked up on the first reading. Korda, Mr. Korda, the author of these two books, says, Ike had prepared himself for the task of writing his memoirs by rereading Grant's memoirs, perhaps the greatest work of nonfiction in American literature. I just want you to dwell on that for a second. Grant's memoirs as the greatest work of nonfiction in American literature. And like Grant, Eisenhower aimed for simplicity and simple fact. As a result, Crusade in Europe remains one of the clearest and least opinionated books to come out of World War II, and by far the least exculpatory and the least judgmental. If Ike had an axe to grind, he avoided grinding it in his book. His book is also free of the small-minded bitterness and acid criticism of colleagues, unsweetened by victory, time, and second thoughts, which marked the books of other leaders. That made me think I better take a closer look at Grant's memoirs and Ike's. What Korda is saying is, although there were plenty of people around them whose reputations they could have smeared with justification, neither man did that. There's something about them that would not let them hurt a man's reputation in that way, even if they deserved it. So here are two concrete examples from both memoirs. First, Grant's memoirs, Civil War. It involves a Union general named William Rosecrans, who by and large was a really, really good officer. However, in 1863, Rosecrans engineers a move that's brilliant. He drives the rebels out of Chattanooga, Tennessee. They retreat south through the mountains, trying to escape into northern Georgia. Rosecrans goes in pursuit. He thinks they are going to keep running, but they don't. They turn and fight at Chickamauga Creek. Rosecrans initially does well, but during the battle, he mistakenly believes that a gap has opened in his lines. So he shifts a large number of his men from one part of the front to this apparent gap in the line. In fact, there is no gap. And in pulling out the men from his left, he creates a gap. And Longstreet's rebels have just come on the scene. They see the opening and they pour through. The Union Army breaks and retreats in chaos back to Chattanooga. 2/3 of the army runs, 1/3 of it holds its ground. General Thomas, the Union general, holds the line, protects the retreat. General Thomas will become known as the Rock of Chickamauga. Where is William Rosecrans at this point? He did not stay at the front. He ran with the 2/3 of his army back to Chattanooga. And you could argue that he understood they would have to set up a defensive perimeter around the city, and he was going to organize that. But that's not what happened. The retreat... Well, no, let me give you the casualties first. The casualties are really staggering. The casualty... Rosecrans lost 1/3 of his army at Chickamauga. He had almost 2,000 killed in action, almost 10,000 wounded, close to 5,000 captured and missing in action. 30% casualties. This was the greatest Union defeat in the Western Theater. It was a big deal. Anyway, they're back in Chattanooga, and it is clear what's happening. The Confederates have come in hot pursuit. They are overlooking the city now. They are on the mountains overlooking Chattanooga. They dominate the supply lines. No food can get into the city. The Union Army, if it doesn't do something, is going to starve to death. Rosecrans sits and sits and sits. And back in Washington, Secretary of War Stanton and Lincoln are getting really alarmed. And Lincoln, who never had a harsh word to say about anybody, says of William Rosecrans, Rosecrans is confused and stunned like a duck hit on the head. They send for Grant. Grant has recently been injured in a riding accident. It is very hard for him to move, let alone cross the mountains, evading the Confederates, but he gets into the city. Rosecrans has become paralyzed. He does nothing to rescue the situation. His subordinate officers love him, but the man is broken psychologically somehow. And Grant will take over. Rosecrans will be sidelined. The counterattack will eventually come and be successful. The rebels will be driven back to Georgia. But here's the deal. A huge defeat, a city almost lost. And what is it that Grant says in his memoirs about Rosecrans? Here's what he says. We held a brief interview in which he described very clearly the situation at Chattanooga and made some excellent suggestions as to what should be done. My only wonder was that he had not carried them out. That is the worst Grant says about this guy. Now, Grant's restraint was even more amazing for this reason. After the war, Rosecrans, he's a congressman from California. He's in Washington, D.C. This is at the time that the bank, Grant and Ward, fails. Grant suddenly, and the country wonders, what the heck happened to this? He starts issuing orders in his own personal slang, not in the conventional standard military language. His subordinates, half the time, do not know what the heck the man's talking about. And it takes them hours, if not days, to figure out what he means. Fredendall will not even use the standard map grids. This designates locations. It helps units move in unison. He has his own special language for maps, again causing great confusion among the true fighting men 70 miles away. He invents his own code, which he doesn't share with everybody. Communication gets worse. And finally, he starts splitting up his units in such a way that they cannot mutually reinforce each other. The result of this is, at a place, I've never heard this word spoken, I may mispronounce it, the Kasserine Pass. Kasserine? Okay. This is February 1943. The upshot of this man's garbled leadership and instructions is that 6,500 Americans are killed, 3,500 British and Free French are killed, the Rommel's Africa Corps rolls over them and pushes the Allied line back 50 miles. Casualty rate is just like Chickamauga, 30%. Well, it's clear that something hugely has gone wrong here, and Ike investigates and discovers that this man is incompetent, and many of his underlings think he's also a physical coward. This man should not command troops, and Ike will shunt him out of there. What does Ike say about Fredendall in his memoirs? That's the great catastrophe, as I've just described. I replaced Fredendall with Patton as commander of 2 Corps. I had no intention of recommending Fredendall for a reduction in rank or placing the blame for the initial defeats in the Kasserine battle on his shoulders, and so I informed him. Several others, including myself, shared responsibility for our week of reverses, but the morale in 2 Corps was shaken, and the troops had to be picked up quickly. For such a job, Patton had no superior in the Army, whereas I believed that Fredendall was better suited for a training job in the States than he was for battle leadership. And this made sense, in a way. Fredendall was shipped back. Ike does not tear the man to pieces in his memoirs at all. Now, this tells you something about the characters of Grant and Eisenhower. But there's a subtext here. Fredendall had never commanded troops in his life. He had not served in World War I. And neither had Ike. Although he had graduated from the academy in 1915, he was such a good trainer and teacher. He was assigned to the States throughout all of World War I. Ike had never seen combat either. North Africa, he was learning his trade. It was on-the-job training of the most dramatic kind. Mr. Korda says he thinks he can pinpoint when Eisenhower, the staff officer, began to turn into the modern Ulysses S. Grant. It was in North Africa in November of 1942. The Allied offensive had stalled at a no-name crossroads town called Medjez El Bab. The units that had seized this place were a little out ahead of the rest of the Allied forces. And the leadership of this group wanted them pulled back. They were too exposed, they were exhausted. And Ike looked at a map and he saw this is a crossroads. Railroads and roads intersect here. Place has to be held. Ike overrules his junior officers and he says the men are going to stay, they're going to hold. And Korda says this is like Grant at the Battle of the Wilderness. At the Wilderness, that first day, the Union troops are just being chewed up. Every other previous Union commander, faced with a similar situation, had pulled the Yankees away, had disengaged from the rebels, had sent them to a place where they could rest and recuperate and get reinforced, and also give the rebels the same amount of time to recuperate. At the Wilderness, Grant said, we are not going to retreat, even though my men are dying by the thousands. We're going to hold, and we're going to keep going. Mr. Korda suggests that this little place in North Africa was Eisenhower's equivalent of the Wilderness, where for the first time, as a staff officer, he sent out general orders, but in this case, he knew this small group of men were probably going to die. And it suddenly became real to him what combat was. All right. That event where the Germans were victorious at the Kasserine Pass, pushed back 50 miles. The situation was stabilized mostly by Eisenhower. he went to the most exposed areas of the front and was right there with the troops, exposed to the same fire, the same dangers, and he's cool, and he's calm, and he's not panicking at all, and they see this, and it stabilizes the situation. And Mr. Corder says, this is Grant at Shiloh. This is exactly the same thing. That first day at Shiloh in April '62, the rebels have a surprise attack on Grant's camps, almost push the Union Army into the Tennessee River. But Grant goes to where the fighting is the heaviest. He's out there with the men, showing no fear at all, and they hold. They just barely hold on, primarily through Grant's example. I think that's a fair comparison. I do. Grant, by the way, I don't know if you know this, that first day at Shiloh, truly the Union troops had almost been pushed into the river. General Sherman was there. He found Grant late at night, actually near a field hospital where amputations were going on. And Grant is trying to smoke a waterlogged cigar, the rain's pouring down. And Sherman says, well, Grant, we have had the devil's very own day of it, haven't we? And Grant replies, yes. Whip him tomorrow, though. That was Grant, and that became Eisenhower. That became Eisenhower. One of the things that strikes Mr. Corder the most about these two men was the strategy they ultimately settled on. There were two ways, two concepts for fighting their wars. One was you aim at a place, a city like Richmond, and you go for it. And Grant began to see that this was nuts. You aim for Richmond, put all your resources at Richmond, the rebels will put all their resources right in your face. And it becomes like the wilderness, a great bloodletting. Grant finally figured out that the best approach was what became known as the broad front approach, and that was, let's not care about psychological victories like seizing Richmond. The object is to defeat the Confederate Army wherever the hell it is. So, we will go after the rebels everywhere, and we will keep the pressure on everywhere, so they can't reinforce one another, and sooner or later, they will break. This was Ike's philosophy in Europe, eventually. He didn't care about capturing Paris. He didn't care about going on to Berlin. He didn't care about seizing the Ruhr Valley. His philosophy became, we put the pressure on wherever we find the Germans. It's unremitting. We give them no chance to rest. We keep pushing across a broad front. So Ike and Grant ultimately adopted the same strategy. Corder says there's more than this that they had in common. These guys had what, well, let's put it this way. There's this idea that one of the great virtues of a military leader is grace under pressure. And Corder says, no, that's not right. What it is that sets the great leaders apart is courage and persistence under pressure. He says that Grant was at his best at Shiloh after what appeared to be a catastrophic defeat. He was not discouraged. He spoke optimistically, did not panic, and he inspired his men to hold. And he said this was Ike at the Battle of the Bulge. The Americans were forced back and back and back, and perhaps another commander, his spirits would have been broken, and he would have been, well, like Rosecrans, something in him would snap. It wasn't the case with Eisenhower. He acknowledged we've been pushed back, but here's what we're going to do. Here's how we're going to handle it. It was courage and persistence under pressure that made the difference. Corda also refers back to Napoleon. He says, now the French revere Napoleon not because he conquered Europe and he was a bloodthirsty tyrant. The French really honor Napoleon's story because of his near defeats. How he handled himself and his army. For example, at Moscow. The French had gotten all that way into Russia. They're at the gates of Moscow, and suddenly the Russian winter sets in, and they begin to freeze to death. And it was up to Napoleon to get them out. Not very many of the French army got out, but enough did. And it was Napoleon's clear, calm planning and reasoning that got them out. This is what the French really admire about him, is what he did in the face of what appeared to be certain defeat. And Corda says, this is really how we should think of Grant and Eisenhower. This is when they were at their best, when it appeared they were on the brink of defeat, and they didn't buy it for a minute. Okay. Some things I found intriguing. Corda doesn't go on about it too much. He says, finally in Europe, Ike, he's the supreme commander, but he will adopt day-to-day control of the various Allied armies, including the British, which did not please the British all that much. But this was very similar to what Grant faced. Grant had come east to take command of all the Union armies, all of them. But he winds up mostly in Virginia, mostly working with the Army of the Potomac, which is commanded by George Gordon Meade. But Grant will take over day-to-day control of the Army of the Potomac. Grant and Eisenhower both came to see that in these complex situations, you had to have one man at the helm, one. And that was the policy they adopted. I'm interested in the surrenders. We know that at Appomattox, Grant said to his cheering men, stop it. We do not want to humiliate the rebels. They are now our fellow citizens again. Perfect opportunity for grandstanding, but Grant did not do that. The telegram he sent to Lincoln was, General Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia today on terms proposed by myself. Period. No grandstanding. I don't know what message he sent to Truman, but here's the message he sent to his armies. The mission of this Allied force was fulfilled at 0241 local time, May 7th, 1945. Signed, Eisenhower. No grandstanding. Now there was one big difference in the surrender. Grant truly saw Lee as an honorable foe and the rebel armies as honorable men fighting in a dishonorable cause, but he was not going to humiliate them. Now Ike wanted to see the Germans as honorable foes, but just before General Jodl came to him, Ike had been to a concentration camp, and he knew that these were not honorable foes. So, contrasting Grant and Lee, Eisenhower and Jodl, Eisenhower has General Jodl come in the middle of the night, stand at rigid attention. Ike reads the terms of surrender and says, do you understand them? And Jodl says, yeah. Eisenhower says, dismissed. And when the Soviets, who are now in Berlin, want to see you, you better go. Jodl would be tried as a war criminal at Nuremberg, and he would be executed. So, these are just little snippets comparing Ike and Grant as military figures. And I got to tell you, on this topic, this deserves a full-day seminar. It really does. These are just snippets, believe it. So now we're going to turn to the presidential years and see if there's any parallels here. For Grant, the great struggle was Reconstruction, reconstructing America after this great division, after the Civil War. And essentially, the recurring nightmare was over civil rights. Civil rights for the freed slaves, would they be real? Restored civil rights for the former rebels. This went on and on throughout Grant's presidency. He attacked this problem in many ways, but one of the things he did, just to make good on the promise that the freed slaves really were citizens of equal value and equal worth to white citizens, he opened up the federal civil service to black people. Had never been done before. There are many laws in the South which should have allowed blacks to vote. For example, the Ku Klux Klan was having a reign of terror preventing that from happening. Grant tried to enforce the civil rights laws by establishing a brand new department in government called the Justice Department. It was news to me that Grant had invented the Justice Department, but he had. The first black cadets go to West Point during Grant's administration. Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist, escaped slave, will wonder if what Grant has been doing through the civil service is real. So in midterm, Frederick Douglass investigates. I'm not sure if it was the War Department, which department it was, but Frederick Douglass went through the employees of this department and found a couple of hundred black men employed there, which was a revelation to him. Grant sincerely wanted the racial animosities to die away, and he worked proactively at that. For example, and this is very dramatic, and I wonder that we don't know more about it, the Klan, which had no scruples about killing black people who wanted to vote, actually took over and controlled 9 counties in South Carolina. They were the law. The state government couldn't control what was going on. Asked the feds for help. President Grant went to Congress, got authorization. He was granted the authority to issue an ultimatum to the Klan. Gave them 2 weeks to lay down their arms, and if they didn't, federal troops would come in. The Klan did not lay down their arms. Federal troops under President Grant battled the Ku Klux Klan in South Carolina in 1871.
We never heard that before.
3,000 Klansmen were apprehended. The lower level guys were given token sentences. The ringleaders got stiff federal prison terms, and they served their time in the federal prison in Albany, New York.
Wow.
Yeah, we used to have a federal prison in Albany. Okay, so my point is that the great struggle for Grant was civil rights and race relations in America. But we're talking domestically, obviously, not internationally. We don't think of Eisenhower as being confronted by this sort of thing. Modern presidents who grappled with civil rights, the Kennedys to some degree, but obviously Lyndon Johnson. The Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act. Little do we know what Eisenhower attempted to do. Now, Ike was not a modern man. He'd been born in 1890. He had his doubts about the social equality of the races, but he did acknowledge that any citizen, black or white or red or green, should have the same rights. And that was obvious. So, I told you I lived through the 60s, and I was told The 60s in part were a reaction to the very boring 50s when Ike was president. Ike was this sweet old, he was a duffer, he was a golfer. Spent most of the time on the golf course. Didn't do much with social issues at all, just let things drift. He was inactive. And the 60s were in part a reaction to that bland period. It wasn't that bland, believe me. This is the 1950s we're talking about. Race relations have been bubbling below the surface here for a while. After Grant left the White House, Reconstruction ended, the Jim Crow laws came in. People in the South were virtually re-enslaved for 2 generations or more. But by 1953, the civil rights movement is starting to appear here and there. 1953 in Washington, D.C., we're beginning to see some changes. By 1954, they are obvious in that racial equality, which is to say non-discrimination, comes to the hotels and restaurants in Washington, D.C., which is controlled by the federal government. This is on Ike's watch. 1954, we have the Supreme Court decision on desegregating the schools. Ike says, this is the law of the land now, and Washington, D.C., we are going to be the model. We are going to desegregate the schools here by the end of the school year. And in fact, that happens. The D.C. schools, 1954, are desegregated with no problems at all. 1955, Emmett Till is killed. Now, Emmett Till was a 14-year-old black kid from Chicago who was visiting relatives in Mississippi. This is a city kid from the north. He doesn't understand that to whistle at a white woman is a death sentence. But he does whistle at a passing white lady, and her relatives will kidnap him, beat him, gouge out an eye, shoot him in the head, just mutilate his body horribly. And suddenly the civil rights movement explodes because his killers are not convicted. Suddenly Ike sees a country where the civil rights cause is catching fire. And he sees the justice of it. In 1956, he establishes a Civil Rights Commission. What he wants to do, number one, is to outlaw lynching. Well, not outlaw lynching, make lynching a federal crime. Across the South, black people are being hanged. Mob rule, the Klan is still a very potent force. He wants lynching to become a federal crime so the feds can intervene when the state authorities won't. He wants to end the poll tax. The poll tax essentially is you come up to vote, you have to pay a fee. These are in the southern states. And if the fees are such that most poor black people can't afford them, can't pay the poll tax, you can't vote. He wants that outlawed. Southern senators will basically stonewall Ike's Civil Rights Commission for a year or more. Now, what is going on simultaneously? As the school integration laws are being finally implemented, across the South, in many cities and towns, the white families are saying, you know, if our kids have to go to school, black kids, in the public schools, we're going to pull our kids out and form our own private schools. And more than that, we're going to boycott any business that's cooperating with this integration thing. So things were really starting to spiral out of control in the South. In spring of 1957, Martin Luther King, who hardly anybody's heard of yet, appeals to Ike to make a speech on the moral issues surrounding integration. Ike will decline, but he will meet with Martin Luther King and talk things over. Ike will not talk about the morality of integration, racial equality. What he will talk about is, according to the law, we are all equal, and I'm the chief executive. I must make sure that our laws are implemented. He talks about the legal aspect of this. And this is what Grant did, almost always. I think he felt that discrimination was morally wrong, but he knew his audience, Grant did, so he talked about the legal rights of black citizens and white citizens. That's what he emphasized. So did Ike. On the integration, the Supreme Court ruling, Ike said the Constitution is as the Supreme Court interprets it. And I must conform to that and do my very best to see that it's carried out in this country. Remember the March on Washington, the I Have a Dream speech? That was 1963. That wasn't the first March on Washington involving Martin Luther King. There was one in 1957. It was called the Prayer Pilgrimage of Freedom. About 40,000 marchers turned up. That was the year the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was formed, big civil rights organization. Martin Luther King that year did not have any real memorable lines, like he had in the I Have a Dream speech, but he did say, among other things, give us the ballot, and we will fill the legislatures with men of goodwill. Give us the ballot, and we will transform the salient misdeeds of the bloodthirsty mobs into the calculated good deeds of orderly citizens. All right, 1957. Finally, Ike's Civil Rights Commission bears some fruit. It's been really watered down by the Southern senators. All it will address is some aspects of access to the voting booths of the South. Ike will look back and he'll say, this was my worst political defeat in my first 4 years. Now this doesn't sound like much, a very watered down civil rights bill, but here's the thing. This was the first civil rights bill enacted in 84 years. There had been no civil rights bills since the Grant administration. The 1875 civil rights bill that Grant had pushed through Congress. So, here's one of those parallels between Grant as president and Ike as president. And I want to talk just very briefly about Little Rock. This is one of those moments that the civil rights historians always point to, and we forget ever happened. But it was on Ike's watch. Integration of the public schools had been ordered. The city of Little Rock in Arkansas has a plan. It's a slow integration of the schools. It'll take 10 years, but it'll begin with the high school. So, it's going to happen. First black kids are going to come in the fall of 1857. I get the dates all confused. 1957. Now here's one of those lovely southern names. Orville Faubus. Let me swallow my breath mint here. Get this really out. Governor Orville Faubus of Arkansas says he's worried there's going to be violence. So he sends the Arkansas National Guard to Little Rock. They surround the school. The Guard is not there to protect the black kids. The Guard is there to stop them from coming into the school. This is not what was intended. A federal judge says to Governor Faubus, you have to obey the law. This is not right. Faubus says, but I'm upholding the Arkansas Constitution. The judge says, yeah, well, the federal Constitution trumps yours. Faubus gets worried. He contacts Eisenhower. They have a face-to-face meeting. Faubus wants to find a way to settle this. He wants Ike to do something to help him save face. And Ike says, the only assurance I can give you is that the federal Constitution will be upheld by me, by every legal means at my command. But he wants to save face because he knows humiliation has no place in this situation. Like Grant, he understands that if you humiliate somebody, it's going to make the situation far worse. So he tries to work something out with Faubus and fails. Faubus goes back to Arkansas, talks to the federal judge, and the upshot is the governor withdraws the National Guard from Little Rock. And sure as shooting, riots break out. Thousands of rioters are in the streets protesting the integration of the schools. These rioters fight with the city police, the state police, and this is now anarchy. Ike goes on television to tell the nation what he's going to do. And I find this brilliant. It's black and white TV. But try and picture this. They got Ike in the Oval Office, and behind him on the wall are some portraits. Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee. Ike was trying to send a message. I respect you in the South and your traditions. I really do. I venerate Lee as much as Lincoln. I just love the visuals on that. Anyway, Ike signs an executive order nationalizing the Arkansas National Guard. He brings in 1,000 soldiers from the 101st Airborne, and they do protect the black kids as they go into the school. And they will be there for the rest of the school year. The mobs will gather almost every day. There will not be any rioting, really, because of the firepower. The kids will go to school. Very few white kids will be there. But in the end, the first black graduates will emerge from the Little Rock High School. It'll be the next year. But this is something Ike did that we have forgotten. He said, this is really, really significant how he said this. He was criticized by a Georgia senator. The Georgia senator said of this action that Ike was applying tactics that must have been copied from the manual issued to the officers of Hitler's stormtroopers. To which Ike replied, when a state, by seeking to frustrate the orders of a federal court, encourages mobs of extremists to flout the orders of the court, and when a state refuses to utilize its police powers to protect against mobs persons who are peaceably exercising their constitutional rights, the oath of office of the president requires that he take action to give that protection. Failure to act in such a case would be tantamount to acquiescence in anarchy and dissolution of the Union. These are words right out of Ulysses S. Grant's mouth. Grant had to intervene in the South time and time again, and he always said, this is essentially, anarchy has come, and all I am doing is restoring law and order. And that was Ike's perspective as well. He also did not appreciate having his troopers compared to Hitler's stormtroopers. He had some pretty hard things to say against that man from Georgia. By the way, here's something that Grant and Ike were not alike. One area they were not alike in. Ulysses S. Grant never used profanity, ever. Amazing, considering he was a professional soldier. And Ike, he's the first president I remember. I picture him, again, as a grandfather, as a sweet old guy who would never use foul language. Ike had a furious temper, as it turns out, in private. And he had language that would burn paint off the side of a house when he was upset. So that is one way in which they were different. Okay. Very quickly, some parallels with international incidents. Mr. Goodwin says that under Ike's administration, we never sent troops overseas, and that's true. That happened in the Grant administration, too. We never went to war with anybody, but it was a near thing on a couple of occasions. I'll give you one example. The British, during the Civil War, had built ships for the Confederacy. They were not warships, they were commerce raiders. These ships were kind of like privateers. They preyed on northern merchant vessels to undermine the Northern war effort that way. And they did millions of dollars worth of damage. So after the war, the North really wanted Britain to pay reparations. And the Brits said they wouldn't even consider it. So war fever began to break out here in America, in the North anyway, saying, damn it, they sided with the South. And they will not even talk about reparations. The only way to put Britain in its place was to go to war. And Grant said, no, we do not have to do that. He did something unprecedented, had never been tried before. There was a new thing, had just been established, an international tribunal in Geneva, set up to settle international disputes. Grant talked the Brits into taking the case to Geneva and accepting binding arbitration. And as it worked out, we did great. The Geneva Tribunal said the British do owe the Americans a ton of money, and the British paid off. Here was a case where we might have gone to war, and Grant made sure we didn't. And there were other instances of this. There was a lot of folks in those days wanted us to become kind of an empire of our own, seize territory in the Caribbean and so forth. And Grant said, American citizenship is such a privilege. I will not force anybody to become an American at the point of a gun. That was pretty cool. Eisenhower on international affairs, again, he did not send foreign troops into foreign countries, but there were times when he was under a lot of pressure. And I'll give you one or two examples and let that be enough. World War II, the French had colonized what was called Indochina, Vietnam being part of Indochina. Japanese are defeated, the French come back, they want to reestablish their colony, and the Vietnamese who've been fighting the Japanese just turned around and started fighting the French. The French are starting to lose. And they turn to Eisenhower and they say, these Vietnamese who are fighting us, they're communists, you know that. They're really bad people. And Ike listens to them, and finally the French are kind of pinned down at a place called Dien Bien Phu, which I can't pronounce. But they set up a garrison surrounded by high hills in the jungle. They didn't think the Vietnamese could haul cannon through the jungle, artillery, but they did. And it looks like their great citadel is about to fall and the Vietnamese are going to win. The French approach Ike. He refuses to send American troops to reestablish a colony. He's not going to do that. He's not a big fan of communism, but on the other hand, he doesn't like colonialism either. We were a colonial country. We fought to throw off our colonial status. He identifies with our revolutionary forefathers. The French say, okay, don't send American troops, but do this at least. You have something brand new in your arsenal called tactical nuclear weapons. They're not the Hiroshima-sized bombs, but you got these little bitty A-bombs that you can drop on the Vietnamese positions. Do that for us at least. Ike will not do it. So that was one of those moments where we might have been in another war. Ike was firmly against atomic weapons. He had opposed the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He thought this was a game changer when it came to war. He was very leery of getting involved in small wars that could build up into nuclear exchanges between the great powers. He really hated nuclear weapons. I'll give you one more example and I'll sort of wrap it up here. Got so many to choose from. This is going to really surprise you. It just blew my mind when I came across this one. And again, it has to do with people being occupied by foreign powers. It has to do with Egypt. The Suez Canal had been built back in the 1800s by the French. And the French and the British had been partners in the operation. Eventually, the British took over the canal. It was their main route connecting Europe and India and the oil fields of the East. In the 1950s, the colonial nations that had been colonies are now throwing off the colonial status. They're becoming free. Egypt is in turmoil. And there's a new guy in charge in Egypt. This is 1956, a guy named Nasser. And he decides, since the Brits who run the canal are paying Egypt a pittance for use of the waterway, he's going to take it over. Egypt's going to nationalize the Suez Canal. And he does. The Egyptians seize it. All right. The British are not happy at all. They want the canal back. So they meet secretly with the French and the Israelis. And the plan is this. Israel will attack Egypt, push the Egyptians away from the canal, and then the French and the English, selflessly, to restore the rule of law, will intervene, push the Israelis away from the canal, and reassert control. They do not tell Washington what they're doing because they know Eisenhower is not going to like this. It's a big secret from Ike. The plan comes off. The Israelis push the Egyptians away from the canal. Turns out the canal is still blocked. It's full of ships the Egyptians have sunk. Can't be used. But the French and the English are about to move in and occupy it, and they do. And then the truth comes out, and Ike goes ballistic. Believe it or not, Ike sides with Nasser. He says, I understand what you Europeans are saying about economics, how the canal is important to you, but I also understand the humiliation the Egyptians feel. You took their territory for nickels and dimes 100 years ago. They want to reassert. They want to show their dignity, their pride. I understand that too. He sides with Nasser against his old allies. The British will not leave, and then Ike increases the pressure. He begins a boycott. Well, let me put it this way. We have a lot of oil here that's been going to Britain too. We don't send any. No oil can get through the canal because the canal is blocked. There's suddenly an oil crisis in England. And then he starts messing with the pound sterling, putting economic pressure on them. Finally, the British cave. And they say, all right, we and the French will leave, we'll give the canal back to the Egyptians, and they do. This is 1956. And I tell this story because one of the things about Ike that was never really discussed as I was growing up was his real respect for the concept of nationalism. He had met Marshal Zhukov, the head of the Soviet army during World War II. Yeah, Zhukov was a commie, but he was also a guy from a small town, a farmer, like Ike had been in Kansas. And they related as ordinary small-town men and patriots. Ike could see that Zhukov was, yeah, he was a commie, but he was fighting the Germans because, God damn it, the Germans had invaded Russia. He was a Russian patriot. And Ike understood that around the world, the Egyptians love Egypt, the Vietnamese love Vietnam, the Americans love America, the Brits love Britain. We have to respect this feeling because it's actually one of the best qualities in human beings everywhere, the love of country. So Ike was very, very careful when it came to possibly precipitating wars to think about the situation from the other guy's perspective. And that was Ulysses S. Grant too. Though the South came to believe that he hated and despised them. He didn't. His wife was a Southern belle. Right after the war, Grant had toured the South, and he had written back to President Johnson, "The South is on its knees. We must not harm these people anymore. They have been hurt enough." He said their cause was wrong, but I understand what moved them. Both these men, Grant and Eisenhower, were much deeper spiritually than you might believe. And that's one of the things I learned from first looking at Mr. Corder's book. And it's one, I'm telling you, it's one of the great joys of reading history, discovering things like this. So, you may think you know it all about a certain period of history. Find another book, find another author, keep reading. You're going to have great fun, I assure you. Thank you.